Story 1. The Vanishing Tourist. This is a tale of an ordinary group of friends who set out on a seemingly normal hiking trip in the wild, only to be plunged into a reality-bending nightmare. One of their own mysteriously disappears, and as they try to uncover the truth, they discover that their missing friend never truly existed, or at least, not as they knew him. What starts as a desperate search in the dense forest quickly turns into a terrifying revelation that blurs the line between reality and something far more sinister. We had always been a tight-knit group, bound together by years of shared experiences, laughter, and the sort of camaraderie that only comes from enduring life's trials together. Our lives had diverged somewhat as we grew older. Careers, families, the usual distractions. But once a year, without fail, we would reconnect with a hiking trip, leaving behind the pressures of daily life for a weekend of nature and nostalgia. This year, it was the wilds of the Pacific Northwest that called to us, promising solitude, fresh air, and the rugged beauty of ancient forests. There were 5 of us: me, Mark, Jenna, Alex, and Ben. We had all met during college and had remained close ever since. Ben, the most enthusiastic of us when it came to the outdoors, had found the trail. He always had a knack for finding hidden gems, the kind of places that weren't on any tourist map. This year, he had outdone himself with a trail that wound through deep, uncharted forests. He had been eager to get us all out there, insisting that this was going to be the adventure of a lifetime. We set out early on a Friday morning, the sun barely up as we loaded our gear into Mark's SUV. The drive took hours, cutting through endless stretches of road surrounded by towering trees, their dense canopies blocking out most of them. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was mid-afternoon. We parked in a small clearing, our car the only one in sight, and started our trek with the usual mix of excitement and anticipation. The first day of hiking was uneventful, though the beauty of the forest was undeniable. The trail was rugged, clearly not well traveled, and as the day wore on, we found ourselves deeper in the woods than we had been in years. The trees seemed older here, their trunks thick and twisted, covered in moss and creeping vines. The forest floor was soft underfoot, a thick carpet of fallen leaves and pine needles that muffled our footsteps. There was a strange hush about the place, as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for Sin. Led the way, as usual, his pace steady and confident. He was in his element here, pointing out different types of plants, telling us about the history of the area and occasionally joking about how this was the perfect place to find Bigfoot. We laughed, but there was an edge to it. Something about the forest made jokes about monsters feel a little too close for comfort. We made camp that night by a small stream, its waters crystal clear as they bubbled over smooth stones. The fire crackled warmly as we settled in for the evening, the sky above us a blanket of stars. We ate, we drank, we told stories, and for a while, it felt like nothing had changed. We were just a group of friends, out in the wilderness, enjoying life. It wasn't until the next morning that things started to go wrong. We woke early, ready for another day of hiking, but Ben was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his gear still neatly packed beside it, untouched. At first, we weren't worried. Ben was known for being an early riser, often going off on his own to explore while the rest of us were still waking up. But as the minutes ticked by, concern began to grow. We called his name, our voices echoing through the trees, but there was no answer. An hour passed, then 2. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays cutting through the morning mist, but still no sign of Ben. We split up, searching the immediate area, but he was nowhere to be found. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air. By noon, panic had set in. We gathered back at the campsite, our faces pale, our minds racing with possibilities. None of them good. Mark wanted to go back to the trailhead to get help, but Jenna insisted we keep searching. She was convinced that Ben was just lost, that he would find his way back if we gave him time. Alex, usually the calmest of us, was uncharacteristically quiet, his eyes darting nervously around the clearing as if he expected something to leap out at us from the shadows. We searched for hours, calling his name until our voices were hoarse, but it was useless. As the sun began to set, we reluctantly agreed to head back to the car and notify the authorities. But when we reached the trailhead, We found it deserted, just as we had left it. The sense of isolation was suffocating. The drive to the nearest town was tense, the silence in the car heavy with unspoken fears. We arrived at a small ranger station, its lights flickering as we approached. The ranger on duty listened to our story, his face growing graver with each word. He promised to organize a search party and instructed us to wait at a nearby motel. The night dragged on, each minute feeling like an eternity. None of us could sleep. The worry was too intense. We tried to distract ourselves, but the television in the motel room only played static, and every noise outside seemed amplified in the dark. It was early the next morning when the ranger called. They had searched the area thoroughly, but there was no sign of Ben. Worse still, he told us that they had found something strange. There was no record of Ben ever existing. No driver's license, no social security number, nothing. His name didn't appear in any database. The ranger's voice was tinged with something that sounded a lot like fear when he asked us if we were sure Ben had come with us. We were in shock, unable to comprehend what he was saying. Of course, we remembered Ben. We had known him for years. We had photos, messages, shared memories. How could he not exist? But as we tried to prove it, we hit a wall. Every photo we had taken over the years, every text, every mention of him, was gone. It was as if someone had meticulously erased him from our lives. The days that followed were a blur of confusion and fear. We returned to the city, but nothing felt right. It was as if a shadow had fallen over us, something dark and unknowable. Mark and Jenna became distant, each retreating into their own minds, trying to make sense of the impossible. Alex, on the other hand, became obsessed. He spent hours poring over old emails, social media posts, anything that might hold a clue to Ben's existence. But the more he searched, the less he found. Then one day, Alex called us, his voice shaking with excitement. He had found something, a journal hidden in Ben's old hiking gear. It was full of strange symbols, diagrams, and passages written in a language none of us recognized. The entries became increasingly erratic, talking about crossing over other realities and the truth behind the veil. The final entry was dated the day before our trip, and it simply read, "It's time." We didn't know what to make of it, but one thing was clear. Ben had been involved in something far beyond our understanding, something that had erased him from our world. We met up the next day to go through the journal together. The symbols were unsettling, twisted shapes that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. As we flipped through the pages, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, as if the forest itself was alive and aware of us. None of us wanted to admit it, but we were scared. Whatever Ben had stumbled upon, it had taken him away and was now reaching out to us. We were no longer just a group of friends on a hiking trip. We were part of something much larger, but it wasn't over. We were about to learn just how deep the rabbit hole went, and how far we would have to go to find out the truth, if we even survived long enough to do so. As we continued to examine the journal, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being drawn into a web of something dark and insidious, something that defied explanation. Our world was beginning to unravel, and with each page we turned, we could feel reality slipping further away. In the journal's symbols and writings seemed to pulse with a life of their own, as if they were more than just ink on paper. And that was when the dreams started. Each night, I would find myself in a vast, dark forest, the trees towering above me like ancient sentinels. The air was thick with fog, and the ground was soft and yielding, as if it could swallow me whole at any moment. I would wander through the woods, calling Ben's name, but only the echoes of my own voice would answer. In the distance, I could hear whispers too faint to understand, but filled with a malevolent intent. Each time I tried to approach, the forest seemed to shift, leading me in circles until I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. I soon learned that Mark, Jenna, and Alex were having similar dreams, each one more vivid, more terrifying than the last. It was as if the forest had followed us home, seeping into our minds, our lives. The lines between waking and dreaming began to blur, and I started to see things. Shadows that moved on their own, figures standing just out of sight. But the worst was yet to come. One night, I woke to the sound of footsteps in my apartment. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, But as the sound grew louder, I realized it was real. I reached for the light, my hand trembling, and when I turned it on, the room was empty. But on the floor, just inside the doorway, was something that hadn't been there before. Ben's compass, the one he always carried on our hikes. It was old, made of brass, and etched with strange symbols that I had never noticed before. I stared at it, my mind racing. How had it gotten here? Ben had it with him when he disappeared, and yet here it was, sitting in my apartment as if it had simply appeared out of thin air. I picked it up and the metal felt cold, too cold, as if it had been lying in the snow for hours. I showed it to the others the next day and their reactions were the same. Shock, disbelief, fear. Jenna suggested that we take it to someone who might know more about the symbols, someone who could help us understand what was happening. But Mark was against it. He wanted to throw it away, to pretend none of this was real. But I knew that wasn't an option. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to just go away. We finally agreed to meet with an expert in ancient symbols and languages, a professor at a nearby university who had a reputation for being eccentric but knowledgeable. When we showed him the journal and the compass, his eyes widened with recognition, and he asked us where we had found them. When we told him the story, his face grew pale, and he warned us that we were dealing with something far older and far more dangerous than we could imagine. He explained that the symbols were part of an ancient language, one that had been used in rituals to open doorways to other realms, places where the rules of our reality did not apply. He told us that Ben's journal described a process of crossing over, of leaving our world behind and entering another, a world where time, space, and even identity could be fluid, mutable. He advised us to destroy the journal and the compass, to cut ourselves off from whatever Ben had been involved with, but by then it was too late. The forest, the dreams, the shadows, whatever this was, it had already taken hold of us. We left the professor's office with more questions than answers and a growing sense of dread. Whatever Ben had done, whatever he had become, it was clear that he had crossed a line, and now we were all caught in the aftermath. As we walked back to our cars, I noticed something strange. The trees that lined the street seemed darker, more twisted, and I could have sworn that I saw movement in the shadows, figures lurking just out of sight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and for a moment, I felt as though I was back in the forest, the one from my dreams. We were being watched. Back at home, I tried to make sense of everything. I spread the journal and the compass out on my dining table, staring at them as if they might somehow reveal their secrets to me. But the symbols only seemed to grow more complex, more twisted, the longer I looked at them. They pulsed with a strange energy, a low hum that I could feel in my bones. At night, the dreams returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. I was in the forest again, but this time, I wasn't alone. I could feel something watching me, its presence heavy and oppressive. I tried to run, but the forest seemed to close in around me, the trees pressing closer and closer until I could barely move. And then I saw him, Ben, standing just ahead of me, his back turned. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. When I reached out to touch him, he turned, and I saw his face, twisted, inhuman, with eyes that glowed with a sickly yellow light. I woke up screaming, my heart pounding in my chest, the taste of bile in my mouth. It took me a moment to realize that I wasn't alone in my room. The shadows seemed to move, to shift, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I turned, but there was nothing there. Just the dark, empty room and the sound of my own ragged breathing. The next day I called the others. We needed to meet to figure out what to do next. Whatever was happening, it was getting worse, and I knew that we couldn't ignore it any longer. We met at Jenna's apartment, the atmosphere tense and heavy with fear. The journal and the compass lay on the table between us, silent and malevolent. We talked about the dreams, the shadows, the sense of being watched, and it became clear that we were all experiencing the same thing. But then something happened that none of us were prepared for. As we were discussing our next move, the journal suddenly flew open, its pages flipping wildly as if caught in a strong wind. The symbols on the pages seemed to writhe and twist, glowing with a dark, unnatural light. We all stared in horror as the words began to rearrange themselves, forming new sentences. And then the whispers started. They were faint at first, barely audible, but they grew louder, more insistent, until they filled the room with their dark, twisted voices. We tried to cover our ears, but it was no use. The whispers seemed to be inside our heads, burrowing deep into our minds, and the words on the page began to form a single, terrifying message. You cannot escape. At that moment, the lights in the apartment flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. We heard the sound of glass shattering, and then the cold wind rushed in, carrying with it the scent of the forest, of damp earth and decaying leaves. When the lights came back on, the room was empty. Ben's journal and compass were gone, and so was Jenna. It's been a week since Jenna disappeared, and everything has changed. The police search yielded nothing. No clues, no signs of struggle, not even a trace of her presence. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air, taking Ben's journal and compass with her. Mark and I were left in a state of shock, our lives upended by the terrifying realization that whatever had taken Ben was now coming for us. I said, first, we tried to keep things together. We stayed in touch, checking in on each other daily, but it was clear that something had shifted. Mark, once the most rational among us, became increasingly paranoid. He stopped sleeping, claiming that he could hear whispers in the night, voices calling his name, telling him things he didn't want to hear. As for me, the dreams continued, growing darker and more vivid with each passing night. One night, I awoke to the sound of scratching at my window. He lived on the third floor of an old apartment building, so it was impossible for anyone to be out there. My heart pounded as I slowly approached the window, and when I pulled back the curtain, I saw nothing. Just the empty street below, bathed in the pale light of the street lamp. But the scratching continued, relentless and insistent. It was coming from the inside. I looked around the room, my breath catching in my throat. There on the far wall was a faint outline of something. Symbols, like those in Ben's journal, etched into the plaster. They seemed to pulsate with a dark energy, growing more pronounced as I watched in horror. The scratching grew louder, more frantic, and then just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I grabbed my keys and ran out of the apartment, not even bothering to pack a bag. I just needed to get away, to put as much distance between myself and whatever was happening as possible. I called Mark on the way, but there was no answer. My stomach twisted with fear, but I kept driving, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. When I finally reached Mark's place, I found the front door ajar. The air inside was thick with the smell of something rotten, and a cold wind seemed to blow through the house, even though all the windows were closed. I called out to him, my voice echoing in the empty rooms, but there was no response. And then I saw it, a trail of dark, wet footprints leading down the hallway and into Mark's study. My heart raced as I followed them, my mind screaming at me to turn back, to run, but something pushed me forward. When I reached the study, the door was slightly open, and I could see a faint light flickering inside. I pushed the door open slowly, and what I saw made my blood run cold. Mark was sitting at his desk, hunched over a pile of papers, his back to me. The room was filled with the sound of whispering, low, guttural voices that seemed to come from all around. The walls were covered in the same symbols I'd seen in my apartment, but these were much more elaborate, more detailed. They seemed to twist and writhe on the surface, as if alive. Mark. I called out, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my chest. The smell of decay was overwhelming now, and I could see something dripping from the edges of the desk. Dark, viscous fluid that pooled on the floor. My stomach turned as I realized it was blood. Mark. I tried again, louder this time, but still he didn't move. I reached out, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder, and as soon as I touched him, he collapsed forward onto the desk. His face was a mask of terror, his eyes wide and empty, staring at something that only he could see. His skin was deathly pale, and his hands were covered in strange, dark stains. In front of him on the desk was Ben's journal, opened to a page filled with symbols and incomprehensible text. But there was something else. An envelope stained with blood, addressed to me. My hands shook as I picked it up, tearing it open to reveal a single piece of paper inside. The note was written in Mark's handwriting, but the words were erratic, barely legible. I can't escape them. They're everywhere, the forest, the symbols, they're all connected. It's not just Ben. It's something older, something beyond our understanding. They took Jenna, and now they're coming for me. I'm sorry, I should have listened. Destroy the journal and the compass. Everything. It's the only way. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. My vision blurred with tears as I read the last lines. I looked down at Mark's lifeless body, his face twisted in agony, and I knew that he had been right. This was far beyond anything we could comprehend. Whatever had taken Ben and Jenna was now coming for us, and there was no stopping it. I knew I had to get rid of the journal, to destroy it as Mark had begged me to. But as I picked it up, I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to read more, to understand what had happened. My mind was screaming at me to leave, to run, but something inside me couldn't let go. I opened the journal and began to read. The symbols seemed to leap off the page, burning themselves into my mind. I saw visions, flashes of a dark forest, twisted and unnatural, filled with shadows that moved on their own. I heard whispers, low and malevolent, speaking in a language I couldn't understand. And then I saw him, Ben, standing in the center of a circle of stones, his eyes glowing with that sickly yellow light. He was chanting, his voice rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern, and as he did, the ground beneath him began to crack and split. I watched in horror as something emerged from the earth. Something dark and formless, a mass of writhing shadows that seemed to consume the light around it. Ben reached out to it, his face twisted in a manic grin, and then everything went black. When I came to, I was back in the study, the journal lying open in front of me. The room was dark, and the whispering had stopped, but I could still feel the presence of something in the room with me. Something cold and malevolent. I knew I had to destroy the journal, to end this nightmare once and for all. But as I reached for it, the pages began to turn on their own, flipping to the very last page. There, scrawled in dark, angry letters, was "You cannot destroy what is already part of you." The room grew colder, and I felt a presence behind me. A shadow that seemed to grow darker and more oppressive with each passing second. I turned, and there, standing in the doorway, was Ben. But it wasn't Ben. Not anymore. His face was twisted, his eyes glowing with that unnatural yellow light, and his body seemed to flicker in and out of existence. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words that came out were not his own. They were the same guttural whispers I had heard in the dreams, the same malevolent voices that had haunted me since that day in the forest. "You cannot escape," he said, his voice echoing in the room. "You are already one of us." I backed away, my mind racing, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to close in around me, the shadows growing thicker, more tangible. I could feel them pressing against me, wrapping around my body, pulling me down into the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My vision blurred, and the last thing I saw was Ben's twisted face, grinning as the shadows consumed me. When I woke up, I was back in the forest. The air was thick with mist, and the trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath me was damp and cold, and the scent of decay hung heavy in the air. I looked around, but there was no sign of Mark, Jenna, or even Ben. I was alone. I tried to remember how I had gotten there, but my mind was a haze of fragmented memories. Flashes of the study, the journal, the whispers. But none of it made sense. All I knew was that I had to get out, to find a way back to the real world. But as I started to walk, I realized that something was wrong. The forest was silent. Too silent. There were no sounds of birds, no rustling of leaves, just the oppressive weight of the stillness. They were shadows, indistinct and shapeless. But they were watching me, following me as I moved. I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest, but no matter how fast I went, the shadows kept pace. The forest seemed to stretch on forever, the trees growing denser and more twisted with each step. The mist thickened, and soon I could barely see a few feet in front of me. And then I heard it. A voice, faint and distant, calling my name. I froze, my blood turning to ice. It was Jenna's voice, but there was something off about it. Something wrong. It echoed through the trees, growing louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. "Come to me," the voice whispered, and I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the mist swirling around me and the shadows closing in. I tried to run, but the ground beneath me seemed to shift and change, turning into a thick, sucking mud that pulled me down with each step. The shadows were all around me now, their whispers growing louder, more frenzied, and then I saw her. Jenna standing in the mist, her face pale and lifeless. Her eyes were empty and her mouth moved silently, as if trying to speak. But no words came out, just a low, guttural moan that sent chills down my spine. I tried to reach out to her, but the shadows surged forward, wrapping around my arms, my legs, pulling me down into the mud. Jenna's face twisted into a grotesque grin and her eyes glowed with that same sickly yellow light. "You should never have come back," she whispered, her voice echoing in my mind. The shadows pulled me down, the mud closing over my head, and the last thing I saw was Jenna's face, staring down at me with that twisted smile. When I woke up again, I was lying on the floor of the study, the journal still clutched in my hands. The room was dark, the air thick with the scent of decay, and the symbols on the walls seemed to pulse with a dark energy. But there was no sign of Mark, or Ben, or even Jenna. I was alone. I staggered to my feet, my mind racing. Had it all been a dream, a hallucination? But as I looked down at the journal, I knew that it was real, too real. The symbols, the whispers, the shadows, they were all still there, lurking in the darkness, waiting for me to make a move. And then I realized the truth. I was trapped. The forest, the shadows, the whispers, they were all part of the same thing, a dark, malevolent force that had been awakened when we entered that cursed place. And now it was inside me, consuming me from the inside out. There was no escape. I sank to the floor, the weight of the realization crushing me. The journal slipped from my hands, falling open to the last page. The message was still there, written in dark, angry letter. "You cannot destroy what is already part of you." And then, in the corner of the page, I saw something new. An address scrawled in blood. My heart pounded as I read it, a sick feeling of dread settling in my stomach. It was an address I knew all too well. My own. The shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, the whispering voices rising to a deafening crescendo. I knew what I had to do, but the thought of it filled me with terror. I had to go back to where it all began. The shadows surged forward, wrapping around me, pulling me down into the darkness. The last thing I saw was the journal, lying open on the floor, the words burning into my mind. "You cannot destroy what is already part of you." And then everything went black. Story 2. A Man Without a Face. This story is about a mysterious stranger who arrives in a small, quiet town. He hides his face behind a scarf and never speaks, but his presence brings an unsettling change to the townspeople. They begin to lose their memories. Important moments from their lives disappear as if someone is erasing them. As fear spreads through the town, a few brave souls decide to confront the stranger, but those who do either vanish or return without any memory of who they are or what has happened to them. This is the beginning of their terrifying descent into a reality where nothing is certain, and the truth may be more horrifying than they can imagine. The first time anyone noticed the stranger, it was on a foggy morning in late November. The kind of morning where the mist clung to the streets like a shroud, muffling sounds and blurring the edges of the world. The town of Latchwood was just waking up, the bakery's windows fogged with steam as the smell of fresh bread drifted through the narrow lanes. People went about their routines, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. He appeared out of nowhere, or at least that's what people would later say. One moment the street was empty, and the next there he was, standing just outside the general store, his head bowed slightly, a wide-brimmed hat casting a deep shadow over his face. His coat long and dark, hung loosely around his frame, and a thick scarf was wrapped around the lower half of his face, obscuring his features completely. At first, no one paid him much attention. It was easy to overlook someone in the fog, especially someone who seemed to want to be overlooked. But there was something about him, something unsettling, that made people glance back after they had walked past him, as if they sensed, on some level, that he didn't belong there. Mrs. Turner, who owned the general store, was the first to speak to him. Or rather, to try to. She had stepped outside to sweep the front steps when she noticed him standing there, motionless. She called out a greeting, her voice cutting through the thick silence of the morning. He didn't respond, didn't even move, as if he hadn't heard her at all. She shrugged and went back inside, her thoughts already shifting to the day's tasks, but she couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that settled in the pit of her stomach. As the days passed, the stranger became a familiar sight around town. Though no one could say they ever saw him arrive or leave, he would appear at odd times, always in different places. The corner of the library, the edge of the park, near the always silent, always watching, though no one could ever quite catch a glimpse of his face. And always, after he left, those who had seen him would feel a strange heaviness, as if a shadow had passed over them, leaving a cold void in its wake. It wasn't long before people began to notice other strange occurrences. It started small, someone forgetting where they had left their keys, a child unable to recall the name of a favorite toy. But soon, the lapses in memory grew more serious. Mrs. Johnson, the town school teacher, couldn't remember the names of her students, even though she had taught them for years. Mr. Harris, who had lived in Latchwood his entire life, suddenly couldn't find his way home from the post office. People started whispering about the stranger, connecting his presence to the growing unease that seemed to hang over the town like the ever-present fog. The turning point came when young Emily Carter, just 7 years old, went missing. She had been playing in the park just a short distance from her house. Her mother had looked away for only a moment, and when she turned back, Emily was gone. The town mobilized immediately, searching every street, every house, but there was no trace of her. As the days passed, hope dwindled, replaced by a creeping dread. Then, a week later, Emily was found, wandering on the outskirts of town, her clothes dirty and torn, her eyes wide with fear. But something was wrong. She didn't recognize her parents, didn't know her own name. She couldn't remember where she had been or how she had returned. The doctors said she was in shock, but as time passed, it became clear that something far worse had happened to her. Her memories were gone, wiped clean like a slate, and in their place was a deep, unshakable terror.
The town was gripped by fear. Parents kept their children close. No one went out after dark, and the once friendly community grew suspicious and paranoid. The stranger was still there, appearing and disappearing like a wraith, and with each sighting, another memory would slip away, another piece of someone's life lost to the void. The townspeople began to avoid him, crossing the street when they saw him, whispering prayers as they passed by, but no one dared to confront him directly. It was as if he was untouchable, a force of nature that they had no power to resist.
But some could not accept this. A small group of townspeople, led by Sheriff Daniels, decided that something had to be done. They couldn't sit by and let this stranger continue to spread his curse. They planned to corner him, to force him to reveal himself, to make him leave their town and take whatever darkness he had brought with him. It was a desperate plan, born out of fear and frustration, but they felt they had no choice. They found him one evening just before dusk, standing in the old churchyard. The fog was thick, swirling around the gravestones like a living thing, and the air was heavy with the scent of damp earth. The stranger stood at the far end, near the ancient oak that marked the oldest grave. His back was to them, but they knew it was him. The tall, thin figure, the dark coat, the wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face. Sheriff Daniels stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his gun. The others hung back, a mixture of fear and determination on their faces. The stranger didn't move, didn't acknowledge their presence, as if he were waiting for something. "Who are you?" Daniels called out, his voice rough with tension. "What do you want with our town?" The stranger remained silent. I said, "Who are you?" Daniel shouted, taking another step forward. "You can't keep doing this. Whatever it is you're doing, you need to leave." Still, the stranger said nothing. The air around them seemed to grow colder, the fog thicker, pressing in on them from all sides. Daniels reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and grabbed the stranger's shoulder. For a moment, it felt like touching ice. So cold it burned. Then, with a suddenness that made the others gasp, the stranger turned. Daniel stumbled back, his hand flying to his mouth in shock. The others cried out, their faces pale with horror as they finally saw what the stranger had been hiding. There was nothing there. No face, no features. Just a smooth, blank expanse of skin where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The hat fell to the ground, revealing the same blankness where his hair and ears should have been. He was like a mannequin, lifeless and empty, yet somehow impossibly alive. The stranger raised his hand and the fog surged forward, enveloping the group. The world around them dissolved into white, and the last thing they heard was the sound of their own memories being stripped away, leaving them empty just like the man before them. When the fog cleared, the churchyard was empty, save for the fallen hat lying forgotten on the ground. The townspeople who had dared to confront the stranger were gone, their homes left abandoned, their names forgotten by those who had once known them. The town of Latchwood was quiet again, but the silence was different now. Deeper, more oppressive, as if the very soul of the place had been hollowed out. And the stranger, he was still there, somewhere in the shadows, watching, waiting for the next unwitting soul to cross his path. Those who saw him again didn't speak of it, for fear that they too would be erased from existence, their lives snuffed out like a candle in the wind. As the days turned into weeks, the town began to fade, its people losing more and more of themselves, until Latchwood became nothing more than a ghost of a memory. A place that had once existed but was now little more than a whisper on the wind. The silence in Latchwood was now more than just a lack of sound. It was an emptiness that seeped into the very fabric of the town. The few remaining residents moved through their days in a daze, their memories fragmented, their lives unraveling. It was as if the town itself was slowly being erased, piece by piece, just like the disappearance of Sheriff Daniels and the others who had tried to confront the faceless man became a ghost story whispered in hushed tones by those who still remembered them. But as time passed, even those memories began to fade. The town's collective recollection grew fainter, like a photograph left in the sun too long, until it was difficult to recall the faces of those who had once been their friends and neighbors. Yet, despite the fear that gripped Latchwood, a strange sort of apathy had settled over the town. The people who remained no longer had the will to fight back, their spirits broken by the slow, creeping loss of their identities. Some part of them knew that whatever had come to Latchwood was beyond their comprehension, something ancient and malevolent that couldn't be stopped by any earthly means. Among the few who still held on to a shred of hope was Margaret Harris, a woman in her late 50s who had lived in Latchwood her entire life. Margaret had seen the town change over the years, watched it grow from a small farming community into a tight-knit village where everyone knew each other. But now it was as if the town was crumbling, not just physically, but in the minds of its people. Margaret was one of the few who remembered the names of the vanished townsfolk, including Sheriff Daniels. She had been close to him, closer than most knew, and his disappearance hit her harder than she let on. She had spent days scouring the town for clues, but all she had found was an unsettling emptiness wherever she looked, as if the people who had vanished had taken a part of the town with them. But Margaret was stubborn, and she refused to let Latchwood slip away without a fight. She spent hours in the small town library, poring over old records and books, searching for any mention of a faceless man, any clue that might help her understand what was happening. The stories she found were few and far between, vague accounts of similar occurrences in other small towns long forgotten by history. There were whispers of a figure that wandered from place to place, leaving nothing but silence and emptiness in its wake, but there was nothing concrete, nothing that could tell her what to do next. It was late one night, as Margaret sat in the dimly lit library, that she came across an old journal tucked away in the corner of a dusty shelf. The leather binding was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age, but as she flipped through it, She felt a chill run down her spine. The journal was filled with strange symbols and drawings, all of them vaguely familiar yet completely alien. And there, among the cryptic writings, was a description of the faceless man. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Crane, a resident of Latchwood from over a century ago. His entries were filled with detailed accounts of the town's history, but they gradually shifted to something darker. He wrote about strange occurrences, people disappearing, memories fading, and a sense of dread that settled over the town. And then, in the final pages, he described a man who appeared in Latchwood, a man with no face, who brought with him an overwhelming sense of despair. Elias had written about how he and a group of townsfolk had tried to confront the faceless man, but as they approached him, their memories began to slip away. They couldn't remember why they had come or even who they were. This had barely managed to escape, but the others had vanished without a trace. His last entry was a warning to anyone who might find the journal. He will take everything from you. Leave nothing behind. Run while you still can. Margaret felt a cold sweat on her brow as she closed the journal. This was it, the confirmation she had been searching for. But it wasn't what she had hoped for. The faceless man was something beyond human. Something that had been haunting Latchwood for over a century, if not longer, and now he was back, finishing what he had started. Despite the fear gnawing at her, Margaret knew she couldn't run. There was no place to run to. Latchwood was her home, and she couldn't just abandon it. But she also knew that confronting the faceless man head-on, like Sheriff Daniels had tried, was a death sentence. There had to be another way, something that Elias Crane hadn't thought of. Margaret's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing through the empty library. She froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, coming closer with each passing second. She quickly blew out the candle on the table, plunging the room into darkness, and crouched behind a bookshelf, praying that whoever, or whatever, was coming wouldn't find her. The footsteps stopped just outside the library door, and for a moment, there was only silence. Margaret held her breath, straining to hear anything, but the quiet was so complete, it was as if the world had stopped. Then the door creaked open and she saw the silhouette of a tall figure standing in the doorway. It was him, the faceless man. She could tell by the way he stood, by the unnatural stillness of his posture, that this was the being that had brought so much terror to Latchwood. She watched in horror as he stepped into the room, his head turning slowly as if searching for something or someone. Margaret's mind raced as she tried to think of what to do. She had to get out of there, but there was no way she could escape without him noticing. And even if she did, where would she go? The faceless man had a way of finding people, of drawing them to him like a moth to a flame. But she couldn't just sit there and wait to be discovered. She reached into her bag and pulled out the small pocket knife she always carried with her. It was a feeble weapon, but it was all she had. Her hand trembled as she gripped the handle, trying to steady herself. She knew that if she was going to survive, she needed to be smart, not just brave. The faceless man began to move again, his footsteps barely making a sound on the wooden floor. He was getting closer, and Margaret knew she had to act fast. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and then, with all the strength she could muster, she hurled the knife across the room. The knife clattered against a metal filing cabinet, the noise shattering the silence like a gunshot. The faceless man froze, his head snapping toward the sound. For a brief moment, Margaret thought she had distracted him, that she might have a chance to slip out the door and make a run for it. But then, slowly, the faceless man turned his head back toward her, as if he had known where she was all along. Margaret's blood ran cold as she realized her mistake. She had only drawn his attention to herself. The faceless man took a step toward her, then another, his movements slow and deliberate. There was no rush, no urgency. He knew she had nowhere to go. Desperation clawed at Margaret as she backed away, her eyes darting around the room for anything she could use to defend herself. But there was nothing. Just dusty books and old furniture, none of which would do her any good. She was trapped. The faceless man was almost upon her now, his presence suffocating, filling the room with an unbearable sense of dread. Margaret's heart pounded in her chest as she braced herself for the inevitable. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end, when suddenly she remembered something from Elias Crane's journal, a passage that had seemed insignificant at the time but now took on a new meaning. "He will take everything from you," Elias had written, "unless you give him something he cannot take." Margaret didn't know what that meant, but she had no other options. She opened her eyes and looked up at the faceless man, who was now standing right in front of her, his blank face mere inches from her own. She forced herself to stay calm, to think clearly, and then in a moment of clarity, she spoke the only words that came to mind. "Take my memories," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Take them all." For a moment, nothing happened. The faceless man remained still, his featureless face unreadable. But then slowly he reached out with one hand and placed it on Margaret's forehead. A cold sensation spread through her, like ice water flowing through her veins, and she felt her mind begin to blur, her thoughts slipping away one by one. But as the faceless man took her memories, Margaret did something she had never done before. She focused on the present moment, on the here and now. She refused to let her mind drift back to the past, to the memories that were being taken from her. She held on to the one thing she still had, herself, her sense of being alive in this moment. The faceless man seemed to hesitate, as if something was different this time. Margaret felt his grip on her mind falter, and she realized that he was struggling to take everything from her. He could erase her memories, but he could not touch her will to exist in this moment. As the cold sensation slowly faded, Margaret felt a strange strength building within her, a defiance that she had never known before. She clung to her remaining consciousness with a fierce determination, refusing to let him succeed. The faceless man's hand began to withdraw, his grip loosening, and for the first time, Margaret saw a flicker of something in his absence of a face. An emotion, perhaps frustration or even anger. She couldn't be sure. The room seemed to shift, as if reality itself was unraveling. Shadows danced on the walls, and the air grew thick with a palpable sense of menace. Margaret realized that the faceless man was not just a physical being, but a force that disrupted the very essence of memory and identity. She had managed to fend off the immediate threat, but the danger was far from over. With the faceless man's presence receding, Margaret took the opportunity to flee. She dashed out of the library, her footsteps echoing in the silent, deserted halls. The air outside was cold and damp, and the moonlight cast eerie shadows across the empty streets of Latchwood. She knew that the faceless man wouldn't give up easily, and she had to find a way to protect the town from his influence. Margaret decided to head to the old town archives, hoping to find something that might help her understand more about the faceless man and his origins. The archives were located in a crumbling building at the edge of town, a place she had avoided for years due to its deteriorating condition. But now it seemed like the only place where she might find answers. The archives were dark and musty, with the smell of old paper and mildew filling the air. Margaret carefully navigated through the cluttered rooms, her flashlight casting long, wavering beams of light. She searched through dusty files and old newspapers, desperate to find any information that could explain the faceless man's connection to Latchwood. Hours passed as she combed through the records, her hope waning. But then, in the back of a drawer filled with faded documents, she found something unusual. An old map of the town with strange markings on it. The markings were not familiar to her. They looked like the symbols she had seen in Elias Crane's journal. Her heart raced as she examined the map closely. It seemed to highlight specific locations around Latchwood, places where strange events had occurred in the past. Margaret's eyes widened as she traced one of the markings, which led to an area of the forest on the outskirts of town. She had heard local legends about that part of the forest, tales of ancient rituals and strange occurrences, but she had always dismissed them as folklore. Now it seemed that these stories might hold a kernel of truth. Determined to uncover more, Margaret made her way to the forest. The path was overgrown and treacherous, but she pressed on, guided by the map and the faint glimmers of hope that she might find something to stop the faceless man. The deeper she went in the forest, the darker and more oppressive the atmosphere became. The trees seemed to close in around her, and the silence was occasionally broken by the rustling of unseen creatures. Finally, she arrived at a clearing marked on the map. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone structure, partially covered by vines and moss. It looked like a ruined altar or a sacrificial site, with strange symbols etched into the stone. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she realized that this was the place described in Elias Crane's journal, the site of the faceless man's last appearance. Margaret approached the altar cautiously, her flashlight revealing more of the symbols. They matched those she had seen in the journal, reinforcing her belief that this was a place of significant power or influence. She knew she needed to understand the meaning of these symbols, but she wasn't sure where to start. As she examined the symbols, she felt a presence behind her. She turned quickly, her flashlight flickering. The faceless man was there, emerging from the shadows, his form more ominous and threatening than ever. Margaret's heart pounded, but she stood her ground. She had come this far and couldn't afford to back down now. The faceless man moved slowly, deliberately, as if savoring the moment of her fear. Margaret's mind raced, trying to recall anything from Elias Crane's journal that might help her. She thought of the warning about giving the faceless man something he could not take. The only thing she could think of was the very essence of what it meant to be human. Memories, identity, and wits. With renewed determination, Margaret decided to confront the faceless man directly. She approached him, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "You may take memories," she said, "but you can't take the will to fight for what's right. You can't erase the people who stand against you." The faceless man paused, and for a moment there was a flicker of something in his featureless face. Surprise, perhaps. He seemed to waver, his form flickering like a distorted image. Margaret took a deep breath and continued, "You're not just taking memories. You're stealing our very souls, and we won't let you." The air around them grew colder, and the symbols on the altar began to glow faintly, reacting to the confrontation. Margaret could feel the power in the symbols, a force that seemed to resonate with her defiance. The faceless man's form began to shift, his presence less solid, as if he was struggling against an unseen force. Margaret realized that the symbols might be part of an ancient protective ritual or barrier, and she needed to activate it. She carefully traced the symbols with her flashlight, trying to replicate the patterns from Elias Crane's journal. As she worked, she felt the faceless man's presence growing more distant, his form becoming increasingly. With a final gesture, Margaret completed the last symbol, and the air around her seemed to crackle with energy. The faceless man let out a low, eerie sound, almost like a wail, as he was pulled back into the shadows. The clearing was filled with a blinding flash of light, and when it subsided, the faceless man was gone. Margaret stood alone in the clearing, her heart still racing but a sense of victory washing over her. She knew that the faceless man's influence had been driven back, at least for now, but she also knew that the struggle was far from over. The town of Latchwood had been changed forever, and its residents, what was left of them, would need time to heal and rebuild. As Margaret made her way back to town, she felt a strange sense of peace. The faceless man had been a dark presence, but by confronting him, she had restored a sense of hope to Latchwood. The town's recovery would be slow and there would be scars left behind, but she knew that the people of Latchwood had the strength to rebuild their lives. Margaret's fight was over for now, but the memory of what had happened would remain with her forever. She had faced the faceless man and survived, but the town would never be the same. The experience had changed her, and she knew that whatever lay ahead, she would face it with the same courage and determination that had seen her through this dark chapter in Latchwood's history. And though the faceless man was gone, the lessons learned from this encounter would remain etched in her memory, a reminder of the power of defiance and the resilience of the human spirit. Story 3. A ghostly traveling companion. I never believed in ghosts or the supernatural. For me, the world was always a place governed by reason and logic. That was until one fateful night when I picked up a passenger who would forever change my view on the unknown. The night was typical for a taxi driver: late hours, dim streets, and the occasional odd passenger. But that night, things were different. As the clock struck midnight, I encountered a man whose presence and behavior left an indelible mark on my mind, leading me to question everything I once knew. It all started with a seemingly ordinary fare, but by the end of the night, I was left with an experience that defied all explanation. It was one of those quiet nights in the city, where the only sounds were the hum of the engine and the occasional distant siren. I had been driving my usual route, hoping for a fare to come in and make the night worthwhile. The minutes ticked by slowly, and I was beginning to think about heading home when I received a call from the dispatch. It was a pickup just a few blocks away from where I was stationed. I pulled up to the curb, and a man emerged from the shadows of the street. He looked to be in his mid-40s, wearing a dark suit that seemed slightly too formal for the hour. His face was partially obscured by the brim of his hat, and he moved with a deliberate, almost measured grace. I greeted him with my usual polite nod, and he slid into the back seat of my cab. "Good evening," I said, glancing in the rearview mirror. "Where to?" He didn't immediately respond, instead leaning back in the seat and gazing out the window, as if lost in thought. After a moment of silence, he replied, "Take me to the old district." The old district was a part of the city that had seen better days. Once a vibrant hub, had long since fallen into decay and disrepair. Many of the buildings were abandoned, and the area had developed a reputation for being haunted, though I never put much stock in such tales. I nodded and turned the cab toward the dilapidated part of town. As we drove, the man remained silent, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery. It was unusual for a passenger to be so quiet, especially one who had just gotten into the cab. I tried to make small talk to ease the silence. "Busy night so far?" I asked, hoping to spark a conversation. He turned his gaze toward me, and for a moment, I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes, though calm, seemed to pierce through me as if he were looking right into my soul. "Not particularly," he said. His voice was smooth but carried an unsettling undertone. I shrugged off the uneasy feeling and focused on the road. The further we ventured into the old district, the more abandoned and eerie the surroundings became. The streetlights flickered sporadically, casting long, wavering shadows on the crumbling buildings. The man shifted in his seat, and I glanced back at him through the rearview mirror. He was now staring at me with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. "Do you enjoy driving at night?" he asked suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "Well, it's not bad," I replied. "It's usually pretty quiet, which is nice. Sometimes, though, you get some real oddballs." The man's lips curled into a faint, knowing smile. "I'm sure you've met quite a few interesting people." I nodded, unsure of how to respond. His question seemed oddly personal for a stranger. It was as if he knew something about me that he shouldn't. I tried to shake off the feeling and focused on navigating the increasingly desolate streets. "Have you lived here long?" The man continued, his tone casual but probing. I hesitated. "A few years. I moved here for work. Why do you ask?" "I like to know about the places I visit," he said simply, "and the people who inhabit them." There was something off about the way he spoke, a sense of detachment that made my skin crawl. I turned my attention back to the road, hoping to end the unsettling conversation. But the man wasn't finished. "You know," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "the old district holds many secrets. Some of them are best left undisturbed." I glanced back at him again, my heart racing. "What do you mean by that?" He just smiled, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. We continued through the old district, the silence between us growing more palpable. The buildings seemed to lean in, as if listening to our conversation, and the air grew heavier with every passing minute. The man's presence in the cab felt more oppressive with each mile. As we reached the heart of the old district, I noticed we were approaching an area I hadn't driven through in years. The streets were even more desolate, and the buildings appeared to be on the verge of collapse. The cab's headlights cut through the darkness, revealing graffiti-covered walls and broken windows. "Just up ahead," the man said, pointing to a narrow alleyway. "You can drop me off here." I pulled the cab to a stop, and the man opened the door. He hesitated for a moment, as if considering whether to say something else. Then, with a final, piercing look, he stepped out of the cab and disappeared into the darkness. I watched him go, feeling a growing sense of unease. The alley was a labyrinth of shadows and decay, and I felt an inexplicable urge to follow him. but I knew better than to venture into such a place, so I turned the cab around and drove away. The next morning, I was still haunted by the encounter. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When I drove back to the old district to clear my head, I noticed a small crowd gathered around a newly erected memorial. It was a modest stone marker with a plaque that read, "It's in memory of Thomas Whitmore, who tragically passed away on this spot 30 years ago." My heart sank as I realized the name matched the one I had seen in the passenger's ID when he first got in. The date on the plaque confirmed that the man I had picked up was no longer among the living. The experience left me with more questions than answers. Who was he really? And why did he choose to visit me on that particular night? And what secrets did the old district hold that were so unsettling they could drive a man to seek out the past from beyond the grave? I don't know if I'll ever find the answers, but one thing's for certain. I'll never forget the night I picked up a ghostly passenger and learned that some secrets are better left buried. And the discovery of Thomas Whitmore's memorial left me with an overwhelming sense of dread. I could barely concentrate the rest of the day, my mind preoccupied with the mysterious passenger from the night before. Who had I really encountered? What were the true motives behind his eerie visit? The questions gnawed at me, and I felt an unsettling need to uncover the truth. As the days passed, I found myself unable to shake the feeling of unease. Every time I drove through the old district, I couldn't help but glance nervously at the alleyway where I had dropped off the passenger. The place seemed to hold a palpable darkness, as if the very shadows were whispering secrets I wasn't meant to know. And determined to get to the bottom of this unsettling encounter, I decided to visit the old district again, hoping to find more answers. I planned my route carefully, choosing to go during daylight hours to avoid the oppressive feeling of the night. However, as I approached the area, I felt the same shiver of apprehension. The memorial to Thomas Whitmore was still there, surrounded by a small, makeshift fence. A few flowers had been placed at its base, but there was no indication of recent activity. I parked my cab and approached the memorial, hoping to find some clue that might explain the passenger's purpose. The plaque read, "In memory of Thomas Whitmore, who tragically passed away on this spot 30 years ago." Below the plaque was a faded photograph of a man in his early 40s, dressed in the same dark suit the passenger had worn. The resemblance was undeniable, and it struck me as deeply unsettling. I examined the area around the memorial, looking for anything unusual. The alleyway leading away from it was littered with debris, and the buildings nearby seemed even more derelict than before. As I explored further, I stumbled upon an old, dusty bookshop that appeared to have been closed for years. My curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to see if there was anyone inside who might have information about Thomas Whitmore or the history of the old district. I pushed open the creaky door and was greeted by the musty smell of old books. The shop was dimly lit, with shelves stacked high with yellowed volumes. An elderly man emerged from behind the counter, his eyes squinting as he adjusted to the light. He looked up with a mixture of surprise and wariness. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice rasping with age. "I hope so," I replied, trying to sound casual. "I'm looking for information about a man named Thomas Whitmore. I saw a memorial for him recently and was hoping to learn more about him and the old district." The old man's expression changed from curiosity to something akin to fear. He glanced around as if checking to see if anyone else was listening. "Thomas Whitmore, you say?" he asked, lowering his voice. "That's a name I haven't heard in a long time. Why do you want to know about him?" "I had an encounter with someone who matched his description," I explained. "It was a bit unsettling, and I want to understand what happened." The old man's face grew solemn. He motioned for me to follow him to a back room cluttered with even more books and papers. As we entered, he closed the door behind us. "Whitmore was a man with a troubled past," the old man began. "He was a private investigator, always getting himself into dangerous situations. 30 years ago, he was working on a case that involved some powerful people. He was investigating something that should have remained buried." I listened intently, my heart racing. "What was he investigating?" The old man shook his head. "That's the thing. No one really knows. Some say it was related to organized crime, others think it was something more supernatural, whatever it was, it led to his death. How did he die? I asked, almost afraid to hear the answer. He was found in that alleyway, the old man replied. The official story was that he was killed by a mugger. But there were rumors of something else. The old man's words sent chills down my spine. I could almost see the dark, shadowy figure of Thomas Whitmore in my mind, a ghost of his former self, seeking justice, or perhaps revenge. Is there any way to find out more about his case? I asked. The old man nodded slowly. There are records and old newspapers that might have information. You can find them at the city archives. But be careful. The old district has a way of playing tricks on people's minds. I thanked him and left the bookshop, my mind racing with the implications of what I had learned. If Whitmore's death had something to do with his investigation into powerful or supernatural forces, it was no wonder he had appeared to me as a ghost. The city archives were located in an old building on the outskirts of town. When I arrived, I was greeted by a librarian who seemed accustomed to people searching for old records. I explained my interest in Thomas Whitmore and his investigation. The librarian led me to a room filled with dusty files and yellowed newspapers. I spent hours poring over the documents, trying to piece together the fragments of Whitmore's life and work. What I found was a series of articles and reports detailing his investigations into various unsolved cases. There were mentions of mysterious disappearances and cryptic messages that suggested he was delving into something beyond the ordinary. One article caught my eye. It was a report from a local newspaper dated the day after Whitmore's death. The headline read, "Private investigator found dead. Case remains unsolved." The article detailed his death and mentioned that his last case involved a series of strange occurrences linked to the old district. The more I read, the clearer it became that Whitmore had been entangled in something far beyond the usual criminal investigations. His final case seemed to involve a hidden network of individuals who had ties to occult practices and unexplained phenomena. It was as if he had stumbled upon something that was meant to stay hidden. As I left the archives, my mind was reeling with the information I had uncovered. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, but they only led to more questions. Why had Thomas Whitmore appeared to me as a ghost? What message was he trying to convey? The old district seemed to loom larger in my mind, a place filled with secrets and shadows. I returned there one last time, determined to find out if there was more to uncover. As I drove through the eerie streets, I felt a presence, as if Whitmore's spirit was guiding me towards something important. I stopped at the memorial again and looked around, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. There was something I needed to understand, something that had eluded me so far. I spent hours walking the desolate streets, retracing my route from that fateful night. As I reached the alleyway where I had dropped off the passenger, I noticed something I had missed before. A small, weathered door partially hidden behind a pile of rubble. It looked like it hadn't been opened in years. Driven by an overwhelming sense of curiosity, I approached the door and tried to open it. It creaked on its hinges, revealing a dark, narrow passageway leading underground. My heart pounded in my chest as I descended into the darkness, my flashlight barely cutting through the gloom. The passage led to a small, dimly lit room filled with old, dusty furniture and shelves lined with strange artifacts and books. The room felt heavy with the weight of forgotten knowledge. On a table in the center of the room was a collection of old papers and photographs, some of which seemed to be related to Whitmore's investigations. I picked up a faded photograph and saw a picture of Thomas Whitmore, along with several other people who appeared to be involved in his case. The photographs showed them in various locations around the old district, some of which matched the places I had seen during my visits. Among the papers was a journal, its cover worn and tattered. I opened it carefully, my hands trembling with anticipation. The journal was filled with Whitmore's handwritten notes, detailing his investigations and the strange occurrences he had encountered. One entry stood, I have uncovered something that defies explanation. There's a force at work here, something that transcends the physical world. The old district is a nexus of strange energies and hidden truths. I fear that my time is running out, but I must reveal what I have found. If someone reads this, They must understand that the truth is more terrifying than anyone can imagine. The journal ended abruptly, leaving me with a chilling sense of foreboding. It was clear that Whitmore had been close to uncovering something monumental before his death. As I left the underground room, I felt a strange sense of closure. The answers I had found were unsettling, but they also provided a clearer picture of the ghostly passenger's purpose. Thomas Whitmore had been trying to reveal something important, and in some way, he had succeeded by reaching out to me from beyond the grave. The old district remained a place of mystery and darkness, but I now understood that its secrets were tied to something far greater than I had ever imagined. As I drove away from the area for the final time, I couldn't help but feel that I had been a part of something much larger than myself. The encounter with the ghostly passenger had changed me forever. I had been forced to confront the limits of my understanding and face the unknown, and as I looked back at the old district disappearing in the distance, I knew that its mysteries would remain with me, a reminder that some truths are best left buried in the shadows.